In 2011, the HBO blockbuster series Game of Thrones premiered on television. It quickly grew a fanbase and earned critical acclaim for its incredible performances, gripping storylines, and intriguing settings. On some occasions, Game of Thrones was labelled fantasy for those who don't like fantasy. The medievalism in Game of Thrones, that is the contemporary cues from the Middle Ages, ignited a strong contrast with J.R.R. Tolkien, responsible for Middle-earth. Whereas Tolkien's universe seemed more conventional and heroic, George R.R. Martin offered a gritty universe where the lines between good and evil blur and protagonists die in the most unfair of circumstances. Both Lord of the Rings and A Song of Ice and Fire are wonderful examples of epic fantasy taking significant cues from the Middle Ages. Obviously, they are often compared to one another, which creates interesting and at times heated debates about escapism, the purpose of fantasy, and what counts as adult media. Defenders of Tolkien rightfully point out that a series doesn't need to have grit and gore for it to count as adult or serious storytelling, but raise a persuasive point about sexuality and violence, often being used as cheap tools to garner debate. But let's put aside these fights and instead focus on the core difference between George R.R. Martin and J.R.R. Tolkien's work as it concerns medievalism. I am not interested in saying which one is better, but to merely highlight a difference worth considering when discussing these fantasy series. But for now, let's explore high fantasy and the Middle Ages. I'm Madeline Rose Jones, and I study history, literature, and culture. Welcome to Snowy Fictions. The main difference between A Song of Ice and Fire and Lord of the Rings is fundamentally how the respective authors interpret the Middle Ages. Whereas George R.R. Martin perceives the Middle Ages through history, Tolkien sees it through literature. I'll explain. Tolkien is well known for being an Oxford professor, well versed in Anglo-Saxon literature and philology. He encountered and interacted with a variety of medieval literatures, particularly in the Germanic languages. This devotion to medieval literature informed much of Middle-earth. We can see the presence of poems such as Pearl, but also epics like Beowulf and the Norse sagas. The chivalric romance tradition, especially Arthurian legend, shaped Aragorn and Arwen's relationship. Putting aside these references, we ought to consider the role archetypes play in Middle-earth. Whether it is the characters, the setting, story, or an object, Tolkien's writings fit nicely with such thinkers like Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung. Archetypes are understood as primitive mental images carried throughout time and conjure specific psychological meanings. Medieval literature utilizes many archetypes, with a personal favorite being the battle between good and evil found in Beowulf. I find this all fitting for Tolkien. There's a timeless quality to Middle-earth, one that feels both ancient and immediate, which is akin to mythology and folklore. I think this is why he was so skilled at environmental prose, and created a distinct atmosphere through rivers, forests, mountains, lakes, and caves. The natural world almost exists in a realm outside of human time. It's no wonder both Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit feel like a re-enchantment of sorts, a return of myth and wonder to our modern lives. Yet this is only possible through Tolkien's literary approach, reliant on archetypes and environmental focus. He's not interested in analysing specific points in medieval history, and there is a distinctive absence of explicit historical references. Literary approaches are transcendent in a really cool way, and I appreciate that Tolkien puts a spotlight on medieval literature. George R.R. Martin, meanwhile, takes a historian's view of the Middle Ages. Actual plot points from A Song of Ice and Fire bear a strong resemblance to actual medieval history, whether it is the Princess in the Tower informing Bran and Rickon's fake deaths, or the Red Wedding actually occurring in 15th century Scotland. Yet what makes George R.R. Martin the stuff of history, as opposed to literature, comes from his lack of enchantment. Core ideas present in medieval literature, such as chivalry, loyalty to the crown and to a state religion, nationalism, the bonds of family, and the actuality of belief and myth, are treated with skepticism and at times outright derision by Martin. A historian's task, after all, is to question and compare sources. When researching A Song of Ice and Fire, George.R.R. Martin didn't just read widely for fantasy, but he also read widely into the history of the Middle Ages. From this, he's just a keen student of history, but these skeptical and questioning tendencies do leak into his work. Curiously, I find A Song of Ice and Fire more explicit in its medievalism. It's easier to draw parallels between fictional places and people with reality. Take Braavos. The city in Essos evokes the canals found in Venice, Annecy, and Amsterdam. The Martel family is reminiscent of Moorish Spain, with architectural cues from the Alhambra. And the northern region, especially House Stark, suggests Anglo-Saxon England, but also the Germanic tribes, which conquered much of the Roman Empire and Europe during late antiquity. Interestingly, the Lannisters and Tyrells are reminiscent of the High to Late Middle Ages, especially in Italy, England, and France. These aren't mere references, but indicate an author who took significant care to symbolize medieval history. If you'd like to learn more about the historical parallels between Game of Thrones and real history, I highly suggest Carolynne Larrington's academic books, which have inspired my thinking. I have linked both below. To put it all together, we should also consider the filming locations of Middle-earth and Westeros. Whereas New Zealand provided the landscape for Tolkien's universe, Westeros and Essos took advantage of the already built-in architecture and towns found in Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. This also speaks to a core point of historical versus literary approaches. The former feels closer, grittier, and more real, whereas the latter takes the shape of dreams and myth. Both, as I argue, have their place in the fantasy genre. Please note that just because George.R.R. Martin takes a historical approach, this doesn't mean his view of the Middle Ages is more correct or valid, because it isn't. So often, I take issue with medievalists who minimize or dismiss the importance of chivalry, belief, loyalty, and nationhood. These did have significant presence in medieval times, and if you'd like to know where I stand, please watch my video essays on Game of Thrones and chivalry, as well as the one on religion and belief. I also do not intend to create a strict binary between history and literature. As scholars such as Carolynne Larrington have illuminated, there is plenty of overlap and shared ground. It's also true that Lord of the Rings did take historical cues, and there is a presence of medieval letters in A Song of Ice and Fire. Understanding the Middle Ages, after all, does require written sources, which often take narrative forms, whether it is poetry, chronicles, or epics, and it always helps to appreciate the historical context these writings were composed in. Beowulf, which informed Tolkien, came into existence through the contacts between Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons. Also, it's not controversial to point out the difference in worldviews between Tolkien and Martin. Whereas Tolkien appears as a wistful, melancholic dreamer, George.R.R. Martin is a gritty and cynical dramatist. There's politics and religion too, which is only a scratch at the surface at their differences. But to be honest, there are plenty of think pieces about those topics already. I made this video not to prove Tolkien or Martin superior to the other, or to enforce my view of what high fantasy should look like. Rather, I find beauty in their differences. I don't want every fantasy series to be like Middle-earth or A Song of Ice and Fire. There is certainly space for disagreement and difference. And, as someone who is quite fond of the Middle Ages, I can appreciate the many approaches modern writers may take when depicting it. I'll end this on a favourite A Song of Ice and Fire quote of mine. We look up at the same stars and see such different things. It's no wonder high fantasy has provided such captivating visions of the Middle Ages. But back to you. Who are your favourite characters in A Song of Ice and Fire and Lord of the Rings? Comment below. I'd love to know your thoughts and start a discussion. Subscribe for frequent videos about history, literature and culture. I also have a mailing list, blog and creative writing classes, all linked below. Thank you for watching and I'll see you soon. Goodbye for now and happy Easter.